What happens when more than a century of sporting history is turned into one giant race? Countries rise, fall, disappear, return, and fight their way toward the top, all measured by one thing: medals. Welcome back to Decoding the Numbers. In today's video, we are going back through the history of the Commonwealth Games to find out which countries have won the most medals of all time. And this isn't about one particular edition. We are combining the medal performances across the entire history of the Games, all the way up to the recently concluded 2026 Commonwealth Games. So let's start the race. In the early years, the leaderboard looks very different from what you might expect today. The Commonwealth Games began in 1930, when the first edition was held in Hamilton, Canada. Only a small group of countries took part. But even then, some familiar sporting powers immediately began establishing themselves. Canada, Australia, England, and New Zealand quickly became major forces. With strong performances across athletics, swimming, boxing, wrestling, and many other sports, these countries began building something that would become incredibly important in this chart: a huge head start. And remember, this is a total medal race. Every time an athlete finishes on the podium, that medal becomes part of their country's history. It doesn't matter whether the medal came from a swimming pool, an athletics track, a cycling course, a boxing ring, or a completely unexpected event. Every podium finish counts. As the early editions continue, Australia begins making its presence impossible to ignore. The country develops enormous strength across multiple sports, particularly swimming and athletics, and its medal total starts climbing rapidly. But England is never far away. England's depth across the Commonwealth Games is extraordinary. Instead of depending on just one or two sports, the country repeatedly finds medal-winning performances across a huge range of disciplines. And that creates an interesting question. If you had to predict the final number one country before watching this entire race, who would you choose? Australia? England? Canada? Or perhaps another country that hasn't reached the top yet? Tell me your prediction in the comments. As the decades pass, the Commonwealth Games become bigger and more competitive. More nations join, more sports develop, and the medal table starts becoming much more crowded. And this is where the chart begins to telling a fascinating story. Countries that once dominated the early years are suddenly facing much stronger competition. At the same time, nations from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean begin establishing themselves as serious sporting powers. India is one of the most fascinating examples. For much of the early history, India's position is relatively modest compared with the traditional leaders. But gradually, the country begins producing more and more medal-winning performances. Wrestling, shooting, weightlifting, boxing, badminton, and athletics become important contributors, and those individual medals start adding up. And when you watch the chart over several decades, that gradual accumulation becomes incredibly powerful. A country doesn't need to have one extraordinary games to climb this leaderboard. Sometimes, consistency is the real superpower. One medal at one Games, another medal 4 years later, then another generation arrives and adds even more. Do that for decades, and suddenly a country that once looked far away from the leaders is sitting among the biggest medal winners in Commonwealth Games history. Now keep an eye on countries such as South Africa, New Zealand, and Jamaica. Each has its own sporting identity. South Africa develops strength across athletics, swimming, and other events. New Zealand consistently punches above its population size. And Jamaica becomes one of the world's most recognizable sprinting nations, producing athletes capable of dominating the track. But the Commonwealth Games aren't only about the countries at the very top. Look further down the leaderboard, and you'll see something just as interesting. Nations that may not have thousands of medals, but have created unforgettable sporting moments with every medal they have won. And that is one of my favorite things about this chart. A medal is only one number on the screen, but behind that number is an athlete. Someone who trained for years for a few seconds of competition. Someone who may have traveled across the world carrying the expectations of an entire country. Someone who stepped onto the podium and permanently added their name to their nation's Commonwealth Games history. Now, as we move through the modern era, The competition becomes even more intense. The games continue to expand, sporting standards rise, and countries become increasingly specialized in events where they can compete for medals. Australia and England continue to battle at the very top. Canada remains one of the most consistent medal winning nations. India continues its long term rise. New Zealand maintains its remarkable record relative to its population. South Africa, Jamaica, and several other nations continue to add to their totals. And every 4 years, the numbers change again. Then comes 2026. The latest Commonwealth Games have now concluded, meaning the newest generation of athletes has officially added its medals to this enormous historical record. And this is where I want you to look carefully at the final leaderboard. Which countries are sitting at the top? Which nations have climbed the most over the decades? Which countries have surprised you? And perhaps the most interesting question of all, which country do you think could be much higher on this leaderboard a few Commonwealth Games from now? Because that's the beauty of a historical medal race. The leaderboard might show the past, but it also gives us clues about the future. Some countries have been near the top for almost the entire history of the games. Others have spent decades slowly climbing, and some have only recently started making a serious impact. But every single medal changes the story. From the first Commonwealth Games in 1930 to the conclusion of the 2026 edition, this competition has grown from a relatively small sporting gathering into a huge international celebration featuring athletes from across the Commonwealth. And when all those medals are finally added together, the numbers reveal something remarkable. So now that we've reached the end of our total medal race, I want to know from you, which country's journey surprised you the most? Was it one of the traditional powerhouses at the top, or a country that quietly climbed the leaderboard over the decades? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed watching more than a century of Commonwealth Games history unfold through data, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Decoding the Numbers.